On a dark October night, Sam, a young adventurer, decided to take a desolate road that cut through a forest. This road was infamous for strange stories whispered about in the local towns. But Sam didn't believe in such things. To him, they were nothing but rural legends meant to scare the gullible. Behind the wheel of his car, he played some soft music. A cool breeze came through the windows as the trees, now mere shadows in the night, lined either side of the road. The further he drove, the quieter the world became. After about an hour of driving, the car suddenly jerked. Sam immediately slammed on the brakes. The engine sputtered and died. One by one, the lights on the dashboard dimmed until the car was enveloped in darkness. He was stranded in the middle of nowhere. Sam checked his phone, no signal. Frustration swelled inside him as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady his nerves. That's when he heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from outside the car. Instinctively, he rolled up the windows and locked the doors. His heart was racing. The sound of rustling leaves was growing closer. He looked around nervously, but the darkness concealed whatever or whoever was out there. Only silence and the persistent rustling. Suddenly, a tall, shadowy figure emerged from between the trees. Upon closer inspection, Sam realized it was a man, standing still with a black hat pulled low over his face, staring directly at him. The man didn't move. He stood there. Then slowly he took a step forward. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he double-checked the locks on the windows. But the man kept moving toward the car. Sam's thoughts raced. He had to get out of there. He turned the key in the ignition again. To his surprise, the engine roared to life. A wave of relief swept over him, and he pressed down on the gas pedal. The car shot forward as he tried to put as much distance between him and the strange man as possible. But as he picked up speed, the man suddenly appeared again, this time right in the middle of the road. Sam slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car collided with the man. Sam let out a short cry and brought the car to a screeching halt. His eyes frantically scanned the road. There was no sign of the man. Sam got out of the car and looked around. The road was empty, swallowed by the night. The man had vanished. Confused and terrified, he jumped back into the car, locking the doors. But then he felt it. Something moved in the back seat. Sam glanced in the rearview mirror. There he was, the man in the black hat, sitting in the back seat, his face obscured by darkness, but his eyes, two pale white orbs staring directly at Sam. Before Sam could react, the man let out a cold, chilling laugh. Slowly, his hand reached out towards Sam's shoulder. Sam's breath came in shallow gasps. He slammed the car into reverse, trying desperately to escape. But no matter how fast he drove, the road seemed endless, as if it looped in on itself. He kept glancing back, and every time he did, the man was still there, sitting calmly in the back seat. Finally, Sam found himself on a road he had never seen before. It was narrow and cobbled, leading deep into the dark forest. But he couldn't stop. As he drove, the man's laugh grew louder and louder. Without warning, the car veered off the road and slammed into a tree. Everything went black. Hours later, the police arrived at the scene. The car was completely wrecked, but Sam was nowhere to be found. The only trace of him was a trail of bloody footprints leading from the car into the forest, and they never found where those footprints ended. Reza, a truck driver with years of experience traveling long, lonely roads at night, had grown accustomed to the solitude. The roads were his life, and the stories of strange occurrences didn't concern him. To him, they were just that, stories. That night was like any other, as Reza hauled his load through the dark and winding roads. It was well past midnight, and the highway was completely empty. The only sound was the low hum of his truck's engine cutting through the stillness of the night. Reza was tired. His eyes felt heavy, and he was thinking about pulling over for a quick rest. Suddenly, in the distance, a shadow appeared on the side of the road. He squinted, unsure if it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. As he turned on his high beams, the shape became clearer. A woman stood alone, waving for help. For a moment, Reza hesitated. Picking up a stranger in the dead of night didn't feel right, but leaving a woman stranded in the middle of nowhere felt even worse. He slowly pulled the truck to the side of the road and rolled down the window. "Do you need help, miss?" he asked, leaning out. The woman walked closer, her face partially hidden in the shadows. She wore a long, white dress that fluttered in the night breeze. Her voice was soft and tired when she spoke. "Could you give me a ride? It's a long way ahead." Reza gestured for her to get in. She opened the door slowly and slid into the passenger seat. Something about her was off. She was cold, unnaturally cold. Reza could feel it in the air, but he brushed it off. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road. For a few minutes, they drove in silence. The woman sat quietly beside him, staring out into the darkness. The silence between them felt heavier with every passing second. Trying to break the tension, Reza asked, "Where are you headed?" Without looking at him, the woman replied softly, "Home." "Where's home?" She paused for a moment, her voice even colder than before. "Not far. Very close." The answer unsettled him, but Reza decided not to push further. The road ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, the night wrapping them in its eerie quiet. A few minutes later, Reza glanced in the rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. In the darkness behind the truck, he thought he saw movement, something or someone following them. He shook his head and looked again, but there was nothing. Just the empty road and the deep black of the night. Maybe it was the exhaustion getting to him. But then, from the corner of his eye, Reza noticed something unsettling. The woman's face had grown even paler, almost lifeless. Her hands, resting stiffly on her lap, were motionless, and her body seemed unnaturally still. Reza gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to calm his nerves. Suddenly, the woman spoke, her voice sharper this time. "Stop the truck here." Reza looked around in confusion. There was nothing but dark woods on either side of the road. "Here? But there's nothing." "Stop the truck," she repeated, her tone commanding. Unable to refuse, Reza slowly pulled the truck to the side of the road. The woman opened the door without a word and stepped out into the night. He watched her walk towards the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Minutes passed. Reza sat frozen in his seat, unsure of what to do. Should he wait? Should he leave? Something about the woman had unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain. Just as he was about to start the truck and drive away, the passenger door suddenly creaked open again. Reza's heart leaped into his throat as he turned to see the woman back in the seat next to him. But something was different. Her face was even paler, her expression void of any warmth. And her eyes were staring directly into his, unblinking and cold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The eerie silence between them was enough to freeze Reza's blood. She simply smiled, a chilling, ghostly smile that sent shivers down his spine. Reza couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his foot on the gas and sped down the road, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't escape the feeling of her eyes on him. After what felt like hours of frantic driving, Reza finally saw a small rest stop in the distance. He pulled the truck over and leaped out, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he looked back at the passenger seat, it was empty. The woman was gone. Confused and terrified, Reza searched the area around the truck. There was no trace of her. But then, his eyes caught something on the windshield, a faint set of fingerprints smeared across the glass, as if someone had been pressing their cold, ghostly hands against it. And in that moment, Reza realized he wasn't alone on the road that night. Michael, a seasoned driver who had spent countless nights on empty highways, found peace in the solitude of the road. The darkness, stretching endlessly before him, was his constant companion. But tonight something felt off. The air was thick, and an unsettling silence hung in the atmosphere, one that gnawed at his nerves. It was well past midnight, and Michael was driving down a deserted road, the mountains looming ominously on either side. The streetlights were dead, and the only source of illumination was his truck's headlights piercing through the void. His eyes, heavy from the long hours behind the wheel, scanned the road ahead when suddenly, something appeared in the distance. A woman, injured and barely standing, stumbling in the middle of the road. Michael slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. His hands trembled as he stared in disbelief. The woman, covered in blood, was standing there, her clothes torn and her face twisted in pain. Michael jumped out of the truck and rushed to her side. "Hey, are you okay? What happened?" he asked, his voice thick with panic. The woman, barely able to speak, whispered, "Help, please." He couldn't just leave her there. Without thinking twice, he lifted her frail body and gently placed her in the back seat of the truck. As the woman sat in the back seat, she closed her eyes, her breath shallow and weak. Michael, his heart pounding, sped off, frantically searching for a hospital or any sign of help. But the road stretched on, empty and silent. Minutes passed, and Michael glanced into the rearview mirror. The woman had stopped moving. Her breathing had ceased, and her face was unnervingly still. Miss? Michael called out, his voice cracking with dread. No response. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, his hands shaking. Panic surged through him as he opened the back door. The woman was lifeless. Her skin was pale, her eyes closed. She wasn't breathing anymore. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned closer. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. Michael stumbled back, his mind reeling. How was this possible? She was dead, wasn't she? I don't understand. You were. Michael stammered, his voice barely audible. The woman's lifeless eyes locked onto his, and in a voice as cold as death itself, she whispered, "I can't leave. Not yet." Chilled to the bone, Michael slammed the door shut and rushed back to the driver's seat. He started the engine, his mind racing as fast as the truck down the road. But no matter how fast he drove, the air in the truck felt heavier and colder. It was as if something or someone was still there with him. Minutes passed, and Michael dared to glance in the rearview mirror again. The woman was gone. He let out a shaky breath, trying to calm his nerves. Maybe it had all been in his head. Maybe the exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But just as he began to relax, a voice, soft and chilling, whispered from the passenger seat next to him, "You can't run from me." Michael's blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned his head to the passenger seat. She was there, sitting right beside him. Her face was no longer that of a wounded woman, but something far more terrifying. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, her skin as white as a corpse. Michael screamed and swerved the truck off the road, the tires screeching as the vehicle skidded to a stop. Breathing heavily, he stumbled out of the truck, his body shaking with fear. He stood in the cold night air, his heart hammering in his chest. When he turned to look inside the truck, the passenger seat was empty again. Confusion overwhelmed him. Was he losing his mind? He couldn't think straight, couldn't comprehend what was happening. Just as he tried to catch his breath, the faintest of whispers echoed in the silence. "You'll never be rid of me." Michael froze. Slowly, he turned back toward the truck. Nothing, but the feeling, the weight of her presence, still lingered. It clung to him like a shadow, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He climbed back into the truck, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He didn't know what else to do, so he drove. Faster, trying to escape something that felt inescapable. But as the truck roared down the road, no matter how far he went, that voice remained. "You can't outrun me, Michael." His heart raced, his breath shallow. He slammed the gas pedal harder, but it didn't matter. She was with him, always. The road stretched on endlessly, an eternal night. Michael glanced again into the rearview mirror, praying to see nothing, but deep down, he already knew. She was sitting there, in the back seat, watching him. Her voice, colder than death itself, whispered in his ear, "You'll never be alone again." There was no escape. She was his eternal passenger now. And no matter where he went, she would be there. John, a truck driver with years of experience traveling the long, desolate roads of the night, was no stranger to the solitude of the highways. The road was like a second home to him, its silence his companion. But that night, something felt different. The air was heavy, and a strange stillness clung to the darkness. His old truck rumbled steadily along the empty road. The clock had already passed midnight, and the only light was from the truck's headlights, cutting through the thick blanket of night. The sky was clear, but the air was unnaturally cold. John was tired. His eyelids were growing heavier by the minute, and he considered pulling over for a quick nap. As he blinked to clear his vision, something caught his eye, a figure standing by the side of the road. A man, dressed all in black, standing eerily still in the darkness. John furrowed his brow and tightened his grip on the wheel. At this hour? Out here? But something about the man drew John in, against his better judgment. He slowed the truck and pulled over beside him. "Do you need help?" John called out, leaning slightly out of the window. The man in black turned his head slowly towards him. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes, they gleamed in the darkness with a strange, unsettling glow. Without a word, the man walked toward the truck and stood by the passenger door. Something about him didn't feel right, but John couldn't quite place it. Before he could say anything, the man opened the door and climbed in, sitting silently in the passenger seat. The air inside the truck turned cold, unnaturally cold. John shivered and felt a sudden unease creeping up his spine, but he brushed it off. He restarted the engine and pulled back onto the road. Minutes passed in silence. The man sat stiffly beside him, staring straight ahead into the dark. The silence between them grew heavier with each second, thick and suffocating. Trying to ease the tension, John asked, "Where are you headed?" Without turning, the man replied in a cold and emotionless voice, "Not far." "Where exactly?" John pressed. The man paused for a moment, then said, "Just a little ahead, very close now." There was something in his voice, something icy and final, that sent a chill down John's spine. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and focused on the road. After a few more minutes, John glanced at the man again, but his heart skipped a beat. The man's face had grown even paler, his features more hollow. He was unnaturally still, as if he wasn't even breathing. John's anxiety spiked, but he forced himself to keep driving. Suddenly, the man spoke again, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Stop the truck." John looked around, confused. There was nothing but darkness and trees on either side of the road. "Here? But there's nothing." "Stop the truck," the man repeated, more forcefully this time. Something about the command left John powerless to argue. He slowly pulled the truck over to the side of the road. The man opened the door without another word and stepped out into the cold night. John watched as the man walked into the shadows, disappearing into the blackness of the trees. Minutes ticked by, and John sat frozen in his seat, unsure of what to do next. Should he wait? Should he leave? His heart raced as a gnawing fear settled in his gut. Just as he reached for the ignition to leave, the passenger door creaked open again. John's pulse spiked, and he turned to see the man back in the seat next to him. But something was different. The man's face was now deathly pale, almost ghost-like, and his eyes were staring directly at John, unblinking and cold. He didn't speak, but the air between them grew colder, suffocating. John's breath hitched as the man smiled, a chilling, lifeless smile that sent a wave of dread washing over him. Panicked, John slammed his foot on the gas, desperate to get away. The truck roared to life, speeding down the road, but no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted a small rest stop ahead. John pulled in and jumped out of the truck, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he turned back to the truck, the passenger seat was empty. The man was gone. Confused and terrified, John paced around the truck, looking for any sign of him. But there was nothing, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Then he noticed something on the windshield, a faint, foggy imprint of a hand, slowly fading away. His breath caught in his throat, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. John was dead. He had been all along. The moment he had picked up the man in black, it had already been over. He was no longer part of the living, but his mind had refused to accept it. He looked around the rest stop, empty, silent. There was no life here, only darkness and the cold, endless roads stretching ahead of him. The man in black was not a stranger after all. He was death himself, and this had been John's final ride.